Hello, and welcome to Ask John. My name is John Reuscher, and you are watching Ask John. This show was initially conceived with the idea that I would invite people on my show and they would ask me questions of a financial nature, since I'm a financial advisor. But as it turns out, I get such interesting guests that I'm enjoying asking them questions, and that's just the way it's been going. So today is another exception where my guest today is going to ask, I'm going to ask my guest some questions. We'll get it right. And my guest today is an old friend of mine, actually a good Rotary friend of mine. He's not that old, because I'm not either, but here we go. Harry Thomas. Harry Thomas is a native Marinite. He was born in San Rafael, and he's raised in San Anselmo, and he's been living in Novato for the last 44 years. He's a retired financial operations executive. He's the past president of the Rotary Club of Novato Sunrise, which is where I know him, and he's the moderator for the economic session of leadership class hosted by the Novato Chamber of Commerce. He's also on the Novato Economic Advisory Commission. That's a commission for the City Council, I believe.
That's correct.
And he is also an assistant treasurer for Sons in Retirement, and I know him there too. And he's an author. And he's an author of a book called Two Tours. Not too long ago, I interviewed a man who is a survivor of Pearl Harbor, and it was a great interview. And Harry had appeared with him on a panel a few weeks before that, so it just made a lot of sense for Harry to come in and talk about his 2 tours in Vietnam. Harry, welcome.
Well, thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here this evening.
It is my pleasure. It is my pleasure.
Little correction, I was raised in Corte Madera.
Oh.
For all the San Anselmo folks, I love San Anselmo, but Corte Madera was where I went to school.
Okay.
And yes, John, I did have 2 tours in Vietnam. The first tour was as a soldier in the United States Army Signal Corps, and the second tour was a vacation tour when I returned to Vietnam in 2012 to see the changes that had occurred in that country, and kind of in search of peace and satisfaction that the war was finally over.
I'm assuming that you went on your second tour a lot more willingly than the first one.
Absolutely. The first tour was a requirement of having been drafted into the Army, and I was in for 3 years, and shortly after my training in Fort Ord and in Augusta, Georgia in Signal School, I was sent straight over into Vietnam to Da Nang, where I served for a full year through the Tet Offensive. So I was there from 1967, end of January, through Tet in January 1968. A life-changing experience, as you might imagine, and don't regret going, but it was one of those things that happen in your life that make you the person that you are and change your perspective, and it was an excellent experience from that perspective. It was also a very tragic war, and after I returned from a year there, having observed the nature of the war and the fact that it wasn't the American situation was not improving. In fact, I watched it slowly deteriorate. And then when I came home to protests and people that didn't care for people in uniform. And it was a very lonely time, a very difficult time. And I got back in 1968, and the war went on for another 7 years. And I found that very trying. So during that time, I tried to reconcile what had happened, why it had happened, why our country wound up there. And
that is probably the most interesting part of your talk. I've heard your talk a few times, but I think it would be, I would like you to say, if you're willing to say a few things about your first days, first weeks, first months.
All right, well, I was 19 years old. That's very young. Physically, you're strong and ready to go, and you've been trained by the Army, and you're in physical condition, but you're mentally not necessarily prepared for war. And at 19, if you've never really left the United States, and I had only just left California because of my training, going to a foreign country in a strange place in a foreign environment during a time of warfare is a very frightening thing. You don't know what to expect. When I got there, I was immediately sent to a replacement battalion. That's a place where they decide where you're going to be sent next. And I heard all the rumors that people were saying about all the bad things that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army were doing and all the attacks, and they tried to scare you to death. And then I was sent to Da Nang.
Is the fear valid?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
And when I got to Da Nang, it looked like a very comfortable place. I was in a barracks, not in a tent. It was a signal installation. And we had fairly decent food, unlike infantry troops, and a place to sleep that was comfortable, a bunk. And after 2 or 3 nights, I thought, well, it's not so bad here. In fact, the orientation we were given by a Sergeant E5, young man, said everything's fine, this place has never been touched, there's never been any attacks here, Da Nang is safe, you need not worry. And when he left, in came a Sergeant Major, that's a very high-ranking non-commissioned officer, with an entirely different story of what he thought was happening, and he told us that everything the first guy had told us was baloney, and that we should be very careful. And 2 nights later, we were rocket attacked, and I was supposed to be in a barracks that got a direct hit from a 140 millimeter rocket. And it killed 7 men outright.
This is like 2 days into your tour?
It's like 2 days or 3 days into Da Nang.
Yeah. Oh my.
Yeah. And I wasn't in that barracks because there wasn't room for me. That was in the one next door. And it was of course, it was the first time under fire, and it wasn't the last. And it's a very terrifying thing to have happen. You realize at a young age that life is short and that you can't control your destiny. That's a random thing when those rockets come overhead. The kinds of rockets that were launched were primitive and launched in a primitive way. They tumbled a bit as they came through the air. They made a lot of noise. They sounded like a freight train. As they got overhead, they stopped. The sound stopped. And there was a brief moment of respite, or when you didn't know what was going to happen next. And then they fell ballistically and hit and exploded. And that few seconds between the time that they stopped making noise and the time that they hit is probably some of the most terrifying seconds of my life, and for many other people that came under fire.
And you experienced this many times?
Yeah, about 7 times during the course of my year. Yeah, there. Not all of the rocket attacks were as close as this one, but they were just as terrifying.
And you talk about being in a guard tower.
Yeah.
Is this a picture?
Yeah, that's me.
That's you in the guard tower.
Da Nang in 1968. I was on guard duty. This was just before sunset, and we would serve 4-hour shifts on and off through the night. If you were new there, you did this about once a week. And I was on guard duty one night up in a guard tower, probably 14 or 15 feet off the ground, and an attack occurred. And I actually saw the rockets launched from about 6 miles out. You could see a slight flash and watch them come in and hit the air base. And that's quite an experience.
Are you in a situation where you're the only person who sees that, or
no? I imagine there were other people that
other
actually
people
saw
in guard towers,
but,
or
yes, okay. I'm sure there were others, but a handful of us.
Yeah.
And it's a bit like the 4th of July. When they hit, they explode. They produce fire and flame, and they're rather pretty, actually. But as I watched this happen, I realized that as they got closer, being up in the air is a very bad place to be, because explosions blow from the ground up, and the place you want to be in an explosion is flat on the ground so that you're not caught by any of the shrapnel or the blast. And I jumped out of the tower. I think I jumped. I remember being there and not being there. Yeah, and I don't remember how I got down, but I know it was rapid, and so it wasn't a good place to be.
There was a ladder?
There was a ladder.
And you don't know if you used it?
I don't know. I haven't a clue. The bottom was covered with sand because there were sandbags in the tower to protect you, and a lot of it had spilled out. So I had a soft landing whenever I got down. But those are some of the experiences of war. More appropriate to my tour there is that these attacks continued in frequency and in effectiveness. And the ability of the strongest army in the world at the time to repel these was limited by the site from which they were launched, which was often near populated Vietnamese areas where return fire was prohibited. In fact, permission to return fire had to be sought before it could be returned. By the time it was granted, it usually wasn't granted, the enemy had launched their rockets and disappeared. And that was very frustrating for everyone under fire. And if you were in the infantry, if you were a Marine out there guarding Da Nang, probably even more frustrating. So that went on for a full year. And
did you get to a place where you, I know you can't, but did you want to check out? Did you want to?
No, the idea
there's no way you can, but
no, and it never crossed anyone's mind that they would go AWOL or leave or whatever.
Right.
I'm sure there were over 500,000 troops there at one time. I'm sure one or two probably had that thought and did, but the majority of the American troops there were there to do their duty and serve their country, and that thought didn't cross their mind.
Very, very honorable.
Yeah, honorable, I suppose, yes. Yeah.
How would you describe it?
How would I describe it? When you're in the service, your responsibility is to perform your duty as expected. You're trained to do that, but you become comrades with your fellow soldiers, and you have each other's back, and you protect each other, and you're there for each other. In combat, I am told, I've never been in direct combat, but under rocket fire, but I am told in combat, and I know people that have been, that you're there and you're fighting for your fellow soldier first and foremost, and thoughts of heroism for the sake of your country are secondary. Now, that doesn't mean that those thoughts aren't there. It just means that in reality, you're there to protect each other, and that's what you do.
And your country at that time was very divided.
It was, but the time I was in Vietnam, remember, was just before the Tet Offensive, before the war became, before the tipping point of the great controversy of the war, as a country was trying to understand what was going on there. And so I said in my slideshow and my presentation to other groups, there were really two wars. There was the war before Tet and the war after Tet. And the war before Tet was one of buildup and one of trying to grasp and understand, and one that had some support from the American public. And the war after Tet was a war.
You say Tet, and there are probably a lot of people who don't know.
Oh, yeah, thank you, John.
Something called a
Tet was effectively the Vietnamese New Year's. It's a celebration of the New Year. The Tet Offensive of 1968 occurred as the U.S. government had a ceasefire, stopping of the war for a brief period of time, stopping of bombing in the north, so that the Vietnamese could celebrate their New Year. During that break, it was not honored by the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong, and they simultaneously attacked every major base and U.S. base and every major hamlets, every major province's capital in the entire country of Vietnam simultaneously. And it was totally unexpected by the majority of the troops, and it was a devastating blow to the American public. The public had been told that we were winning the war in Vietnam, that we were making progress. This was evidence that that may not be the case, was probably not the case. Militarily, it was a disaster for the Vietnamese. It went on for over a month, and the Americans eliminated or took back the territory that had been taken by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. But politically, it was a disaster for the war. And as a result of that, the following period of the war, another 6 or 7 years, was one of political backpedaling, diminishing number of troops in the country, turning the war over to the Vietnamese under the Nixon administration, called Vietnamisation. President Johnson, as a result of the Tet Offensive in early 1968, several months later went on television and told the American public he would not seek office again for the presidency, specifically because of his perceived failure to deal properly with the war. So it was a turning point. So as I said, there were really two wars, one before and one after. The one after was one of disillusionment. It was one of elimination of troops from the country. It was a time when there was actual rebellion from American troops against their junior officers. It was a very, very difficult time. It was also a time when protests against the war grew in increasing volume and intensity, leading up to, in fact, the ultimate end of the war and withdrawal of troops. I want to make another couple of comments. The Vietnamese War, we call it the Vietnam War. When you go back to Vietnam, you find out that it's called the American War by the Vietnamese. That makes perfectly rational, logical sense. That war ended in 1975. That's 44 years ago, if my math is correct. And unless you're 54 or older, that means you were 10 when the war ended, you probably don't have any actual understanding of what happened, and you don't have any memories of that war because it was before your time of forming political consciousness and understanding. And so a huge population of the United States has no understanding of this war, and I suspect in the schools where history is taught that there's so much to teach that by the time they get through American history to the period of Vietnam, there's not a lot of time left to teach it or understand it. I find that, of course, because I'm biased and I was there, I find that difficult to accept, but it's a practicality. And I would very much like that history be taught, current history be taught to young people, because that war, that Vietnam War, had such a dramatic, profound effect on America, on American politics, on American morals, on American understanding of who we are and of where we're going. It was a time, a war that caused disillusionment and the lack of trust in the government. It occurred simultaneously with President Nixon's Watergate scandal and his departure from office. It was a very, very, very trying time. And it led ultimately to changes in American foreign policy, how we view ourselves in the world today. And it should be studied with questioning and with determination to try and understand it. I said earlier that having been there and having been through it, I tried to do that for my own reconciliation, my own source of peace and understanding. And I've read many, many books about the war, trying to grasp what happened. And I find it an interesting but tragic subject. And I would hope that if you have time and you need to want to understand what's happening in America today, you should go back and try and understand what has happened in the recent past and study our incursions into Vietnam.
One of the things I think of often is how the public viewed our military personnel who returned from that war, and how maybe there was some growing up that went on from our experience from Vietnam.
It's possible. When I came back to war, we faced chants of, you're a baby killer. I didn't dare wear a military uniform in public. Everyone tried to avoid that. I was still picked out because I had short hair at the time and sideburns were in, and I had a military haircut, and the only shoes I had were black military polished shoes, and it was obvious that I was, even though in civilian clothes, that I was a member of the armed forces. And I tried to hide, as did many, many returnees. We were lonely.
Yeah.
That led over time, as American troops went on into Iraq for the first time and the second time, and then after 9/11 into Afghanistan, to a different view of how troops were treated. There became an understanding of a separation of the military personnel from the political situation. So in Vietnam, we were tied to the politics, and the politics said it was a wrong war, and therefore, as participants, we were wrongfully treated as bad people.
You were complicit.
We were complicit.
Yeah.
And since then, troops that have gone to war, there's a separation of what their duty is, their responsibility to serve the United States government versus the politics of what's going on. And there's a second differentiation. There's a smaller number of military forces today, far smaller than during the Vietnam. There's no longer a draft, and for those of you that are younger than 54, in World War I and World War II, in the Korean War and in the Vietnam War, to get enough soldiers to go fight in wars, you were drafted, usually at age 19, 20, to join the armed services. You had really no choice other than to break the law and run away from the country. So there was a draft there at that Vietnam War. And when there's a draft, and you have that many people, at one time there were 500,000. I believe there's 1,700,000 people that ultimately went to Vietnam during its 10-year span of the war, that everyone in America knew someone that was in the service that was in the war. And everyone in America knew someone that was in the service that was killed in the war or wounded. There were 58,000 American soldiers, Army, Navy, etc., killed in the Vietnam War, and there were triple that at least wounded. So the American public was very aware of the effect of the war on its young men and women. There weren't very many of those. Today, there are far fewer people in the military. The wars have changed to be more, I hate to say efficient, but that's probably they are.
Well, that's a good thing.
It takes,
yeah.
It's more tactical, it is more strategic, there are fewer fatalities, there are fewer people involved, and the people that are there are volunteers. And the American public doesn't know as many of those people. In fact, I know a couple, but I would guess that most of the people in the country don't know anyone that's in directly, that's in Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan today. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very different situation. And what they do know, they come back, they're treated with respect, and there's a separation of their duty versus the political situation that's going on.
One of the things that you and I have talked about, just ever so briefly, which I wish we had time, but the history of Vietnam, they call it the American War because they had the French War and they had what other countries, and forgive me for bringing this up and then moving along, but maybe someday you'll come back and we can talk about that history.
I think that history is extremely important.
Yes, and you had the opportunity to go back for a second tour, so tell us about how that came about.
40 some years after my first tour there, I had the ability to go back because I was president of my Rotary Club, and our club sends its president to the International Rotary Convention each year. And it happened
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. It happened to be in Bangkok. Yeah. And rather than just go there for 3 days, my wife and daughter and I added on a tour of Vietnam.
Excellent.
And it was a fascinating tour. I went back to find a country at peace. There was absolutely no sign of the war whatsoever. All the places that I had been were profoundly different. The picture, I was in Hoi An in the first picture you saw up there. When I went back, the same location roughly where I was camping out in enemy country. There are beautiful hotels all along the beach, starting from China Beach in Da Nang, running down the South China Sea all the way to Hoi An. Gorgeous 4- and 5-star hotels populated by people from the Pacific Rim, Koreans, Australians, Chinese, Japanese, and the like. It was like shocking, but wonderful to see that change. The economy in Vietnam was different. It was not a communist country, as we all thought it might be. It was a thriving capitalist market with an authoritarian government. Da Nang, where I stayed, was no longer a series of small 2- and 3-story villages and shacks and sheds. It has now, as you might see there, has high-rise buildings in it, has a beautiful new white bridge spanning one of the rivers, and maintained parks and new sewage systems that didn't exist when I was there. Profound change. It was wonderful to see that result, and it was in an unusual way tragic that America lost all the lives and had all the wounded, and the Vietnamese lost so many lives and had so many wounded that the result for the Vietnamese is an independent country, which was their goal from the beginning. Not independent as we might have wanted it, but I would not call it communist because it's a capitalist society. Now, it was for 10 years after the war. Now it's capitalist, but it's definitely an authoritarian government. But it's a thrive.
It's not. You wouldn't say it's a democracy.
It's definitely not a democracy.
Right.
Absolutely
Okay.
not. I don't mean to imply that.
I, as well as I think many other people, confuse those
Right.
terms: communist, capitalism,
Capitalism,
authoritarian democracy.
yes.
You know, and there's kind of separate issues, aren't they?
We could talk a long time about
I
that.
know we could.
I think of communism and capitalism in economic terms. I think of authoritarianism and democracy and monarchies as political systems. So the political system is authoritarian. The economic conditions today are capitalist. And I think
So that would be China. Maybe is the same.
China is the same way. I visited China. Definitely authoritarian, but definitely capitalist. In both China and Vietnam, people can now own their own businesses. They can make their own profits, and they do, and they're doing very well. They're doing as well as they can. They're not doing as well necessarily as the U.S., but they're doing very well. I think, personally, that communism is a dead method of operating an economy. I think the only remaining real communist country right now is North Korea and a little bit of Cuba, but neither of those countries are what I would call thriving. If you live in either of those, you're not benefiting from that economic system. China has taken on capitalism, Vietnam's taken on capitalism. I think capitalism is ultimately what's going to lead to a more peaceful world and other things. But democracy may come, but it has to come in its time, and people have a right to choose their political system, if they can. Yeah. And I think we're running way over time. But
well, you have about a minute. So yeah. So tell me what.
All right. So
what? How do you want to wrap it up? What?
I'd like to wrap it up this way. That the Americans had this view that we are responsible for at one time making countries democratic, and we probably ought not to have. We might want to have that wish, but it's not necessarily right or timely for every country that's not a democracy to be ready to be one or to want to be one. And having said that, citizens of our country have a sacred responsibility to understand political situations and American foreign policy and what's going on in the world and how our government operates militarily and the State Department operates with diplomacy, so that as an American public, the troops that we put in harm's way are put there with our understanding. And we should never allow them to be put in harm's way or in any other situation wherein we don't understand why they're there, why they're doing what they're doing, and who's controlling them. And you can do that in two ways. You can vote, and if you don't vote, shame on you. And the other way is you can speak up. You have that responsibility and duty, just as the people that served in the service had their duty to their country. You have your duty as a citizen to vote and to make your opinion known. You have to have an opinion. And if you can do that, the world will be more peaceful.
Okay. Harry, thank you so much. I'm so grateful to you for coming here and talking about this. I know this is a little difficult for you because you're going through some experiences, reliving some experiences that are not, but I have to tell you, this is a very important thing that you're doing. And
thank you.
You know how I appreciate it, and I appreciate your service.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
It was a
and you're
pleasure.
going to come back one day, and we're going to talk about history.
And that would do.
Okay.
Delighted to do
Okay,
that.
and you come back and check in again. We'll have other guests that are, well, maybe not as good as Harry. Who knows? But I hope you enjoy the show and check in again. Thank you for watching. Until next time. Bye now.